Welcome back to the Dementia Collective, the podcast where we explore fresh and meaningful stories of how people are changing dementia care and the caregiving landscape overall. If you're new here, my name is Andrew Carissa. I'm a caregiver, a researcher, and the founder of BlueBell Village. I created this space because I know firsthand what it's like to walk the dementia caregiving journey. I know what it feels like when you're lost, overwhelmed, and alone. But I also know the strength that can come from connection. Each episode, we dive into people, tools, and innovations that are helping caregivers to find their footing and their voice. Our mission: to make dementia care more personal, more connected, and more grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing. The importance is ensuring that every caregiver feels seen, heard, and supported. Today, I'm excited to be joined by the senior care influencer himself, Lance Slatton. Lance is a writer, author, influencer, and healthcare professional with over 20 years in the healthcare industry. Lance also is the senior case manager at Enriched Life Home Care Services in Livonia, Michigan. He's joining us from south of the border here, so we're glad to have him. And he's also the host of the award-winning podcast and YouTube channel, All Home Care Matters. Thank you, Lance, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing good. Excited to talk to you. You've made a big impact on the caregiving and home care space, especially through the podcast. So I look forward to kind of unpacking what that is, what you've learned, and how caregivers can apply different ideas and maybe thoughts that occur south of the border that we may not do here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So you say in the bio that you've been doing the care and the healthcare industry for 20 years. Can you go back and talk about your origin story? What was your life growing up like? How did it lead you into where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I often talk about how, my life, like many family caregivers' lives, take an unexpected turn, and sometimes the trajectory of where they were headed is changed dramatically because of that experience. And that was not too different for me. When I was younger, I would spend all of my summers growing up going to stay at my grandparents' house down south, and loved my family, but I loved my grandparents. And the only way to really get to spend any real, true, meaningful time was to go stay during the summer, because I live in Michigan, as you mentioned, and, they live down south. So it wasn't like a lot of kids could just, I'm going to go stay at grandma's for the weekend, or, grandpa's coming to pick me up to take me to my baseball game, things like that, which was a great experience for me in a lot of different ways. One, I got to bond and spend some very meaningful time with my grandparents and my cousins and my aunts and uncles that were down there as well. But it also gave me a real deep appreciation, I think, from the earliest ages to understand that seniors are really cool people. They have a lot of stories to share and a lot of valuable life lessons. And I think for a lot of people, they would say, their relationship with their grandparents was probably different than with their mom and dad, because, grandparents get to have all the fun and send you home at the end of the day, right? So I really developed a true love for older people, I think, from an early age. And, kind of to fast forward that, I'd always wanted to be a physician, a medical doctor. Again, from the earliest ages I can remember, that was, a lot of kids wanted to be a baseball player or basketball player, football player. I wanted to be a doctor. And it was simply because I wanted to help people and have, I think, a very meaningful impact on their lives at sometimes their most vulnerable moments. So, fast forward through high school, my grandfather developed colon cancer, and, he had passed when I was 19. Just one of the worst experiences of my personal life that I've ever gone through. And then my grandmother, being a proper Southern woman, she never got her driver's license. She never worked outside of the house. She was intelligent and, things like that, but she never needed to drive. And again, these are people that were growing up during the Great Depression, and life and times were dramatically different back then. A lot of women didn't get their driver's license. A lot of women didn't work outside of the house. They worked inside the house, raising their family and, being that nurturer and things, while dad was out working. And so when my grandfather passed, that was a very dramatic change in my grandmother's life. Not only did she lose her husband of, 55 plus years, She also had no way now to get to the grocery store. She had no way to go visit people. And so she was very isolated. Now, she wasn't neglected or ignored, but, my aunts and uncles that I mentioned previously, they were still working full time. So, they'd stop by every couple of days during the week and visit or, do you need anything? But, there's 24 hours in a day and there's 7 days in a week. When you're relying on other people to take you places or to even have any sort of social engagement and stimulation, it's something I would never want to personally have to experience. And ultimately, my grandmother did get diagnosed with dementia. None of the family even picked up on it, which is very common, as you and I both know. Sometimes you can have that very superficial conversation with a loved one or stop by for a short visit. But when you start looking at, balancing checkbooks and making sure property taxes are taken care of, things like that. Once you get below that, superficial, communication, and you start looking at, the more specific, minute details that are going on, that's sometimes when you pick up on things. Well, for us being, 6+7 hours away, we weren't able to stop by and check in and do things like that. So what happened was, unbeknownst to anyone in the family, my grandmother had a fairly large house, and a large house at night when you're alone can be a little spooky, and you're starting to hear things and maybe think things are happening that aren't. And that wasn't too different for my grandmother. One night she woke up and she was convinced that my uncle was having a big party in the other side of the home. And she called the police because she said she couldn't get these people out of her house. The police show up and there's nothing going on. There was no one there. No one had been there. My uncle was obviously at home with his wife and family and sleeping. And the police really kind of wrote it off because, again, a very small town where, in a bigger city that may not have been kind of passed over or glossed over like it was in that situation. But then a couple weeks later, she did the same thing, but this time she was even more convinced. And so consequently, the police finally did notify my uncle and said, look, this is the second time we've made a 911 call to your mom's house, and she's convinced people are, having parties and doing this and doing that and won't leave. If she does it again, now this was the second time they let it go, but this time they did thankfully notify the family. We're gonna have to intervene, and we're gonna have to take some action that we think is best until something can be put in place to avoid this from happening. And so my uncle called my mom, who was the power of attorney over healthcare, and explained what was going on. And I was raised in a very large house and plenty of room. And so I said, you know what, I'll go get grandma. So I literally the next day drove all the way down there, helped pack her up, and she come to stay with us for several years. And the beautiful thing about that was, getting to spend all that time with her, but also it gave her some stimulation, engagement, and I would even say purpose, because now she's not waking up every day, sitting there for hours on end by herself, or staring at a television. And so we saw the effects of the decline, kind of the brakes were put on them. Now, ultimately, dementia wins in the end, no matter what. And so she ended up having to go into a rehab because it progressed rapidly. And this is over like a 3-4 year period, Andrew. So it wasn't instantly. And then she ultimately passed. And so that was my firsthand, direct, personal connection to dementia. And I saw what it could do to somebody, up close and personal. She became nonverbal. She would not make eye contact. I mean, it was very hard to watch, but at the same time, I know a lot of people want to remember someone how they were, and I can appreciate and respect that for them. But for me, I also feel like, the person is still inside there at some level. I wasn't about to let my grandmother be in a memory care facility by herself without any familiar faces. So for months, I would go over there every day and sit with her for hours. I mean, the aides were ready to build a statue of me outside because they're like, I wish every family would do something like that. And I said, well, I'm not doing it for any other reason than what I would hope someone would do for me if I was in this situation. And it's my grandma. And she subsequently did pass, obviously. And then, life goes on. And then I was taking a paramedic, EMT, then paramedic course while doing college. Because again, I'm pursuing medical school, did those things. And then I'm in the very thick of it. And this is fast forward several years later. And then we get a phone call. I'm now newlywed married. My wife and I got a phone call from a home health care nurse that my father needed help. We didn't know there was anything wrong to start with. And she was explaining he had some surgery and he's health-wise, he's okay. He needs a few weeks to recover. And because of where the surgery was at, they didn't feel he could properly clean it, treat it, and bandage it, nor could you or I, because it was on his coccyx from a fall he had, resulting in a bruise, which subsequently turned into an abscess, and then that abscess burst. My father was in the Marine Corps back in the day when it was a lot different than now, where there wasn't much oversight, regulation. I mean, it was very, very different altogether. And he just felt like, I can deal with this and, tough through it and I'll be fine. Some things you're not going to be fine unless you do have, the proper care for it. And so that abscess did burst and he couldn't properly change the bandages or clean it. So the home health care nurse said, these are my concerns. These are your options. He can either come stay with you for a few weeks while this heals up, or, I can have him go into rehab for a few weeks while it heals up. And I would like to think if most people are able that they would choose the first option and have their loved one come stay with them for those few weeks. And that's what we chose. It did, however, come a lot more than just a few weeks. It was almost 3 years, 2.5 actually. And it was 24/7 care. There was no outside help. It was pretty much myself. My wife's working her career because she'd already graduated. And I got to the point where it was like, there's got to be help out here. There's got to be resources. So I went to have lunch with a good friend of mine, and he's in an office building, and in the hallway, there was a home health care company that was hiring. And so that sparked a great interest for me because I'm doing student teaching at our university, and I'm also working in the labs. And for those of us that have had college jobs at the college, you don't get paid very much. You're a minimum wage employee. And if you're lucky, every semester you'll get a nickel to a dime raise. And that's the situation I was in, at least. And so I asked this home health care company, I said, look, here's my credentials. What are you hiring for? The person who was in the office had no idea what they hired for, what the titles were, the qualifications, the requirements, anything. And I left there kind of a little dazed thinking, this is a company. They don't even know what they're hiring for, or at least the person at the front door, the frontline person has no idea. So I left there and I literally called my wife on the way home and I said, I have a great idea. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, well, I think we should start a company where we send people into the homes to help people like us. I said, there's got to be 1 million people out there that need help. And look at, you're working a full-time job. I'm trying to do this medical school thing. And how can you help these people without having to put them just into a nursing home? And so I researched it. I talked to several of the franchises that all of us would know. And what could not satisfy me though is what made franchise A, B, and C different from each other, right? If I say Tim Hortons, Starbucks, and Big B Coffee, you can tell me the differences, or McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's. But when it comes to home care, what is the difference? What's the secret sauce? What's the Whopper? What's the Big Mac? And I just never could get satisfied. It always was, a nice spun answer, and I'm sure it was very genuine, but it really came down to, well, our founder story and our founder and our part, it all came down to the people that started it, not the ingredients. And so to me, that said, well, they started it from nothing and there's no secret sauce. And so I made the ultimate decision. I said, well, let's just start our own. And now there's pros and cons to that, of course, but I feel like the pros far outweighed the cons. And, here we are now, almost 15 years later, talking with you. And, I later on, if you want, I can get into how the podcasts and the YouTube show started.
Yeah, well, definitely. I want to talk about that in a little bit here. So when you said you were working at college, you finished your paramedic certification licensing, right?
I got the certifications. I never got a state license because I never intended on working as one. But what I did do for a while before my course schedule wouldn't allow for it was I was working in cardiac critical care at one of our local hospitals. And I also had worked in the emergency room at one of our local hospitals as a tech, not as a paramedic, not as an EMT, because as I said, I did the training, I got the certification through the course, but never sat and did the state licensing.
Okay. What's your undergrad in, Lance?
Biology.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Trying to get to med school then. That makes sense. So that's been 20 years since that journey started to now. So what keeps you in it? What keeps fueling you? Because it's probably long hours, complicated calls, the emotional toll is probably pretty high. So what keeps you in it?
Well, the first number one thing really, Andrew, for me is being able to help other people when when you're applying or wanting to apply or preparing to apply for like med school, the golden question is always that they're going to ask you is, why do you want to be a doctor? Everybody invariably always comes up with some form of, because I want to help people. I literally couldn't come up with anything more than, this is the way I want to use, my life as a doctor, is to help people, however and whatever that looks like. It didn't matter. And so, for me, one of my favorite things, because I'm strong in my Christian faith, and one of the parables in the Bible that for me has just always been was, the Good Samaritan. If I don't help this person, who will? Can we help everybody? No, because there is the practicality of it is still a business. And home care is not paid for with Medicare, Medicaid, or I should say Medicare or health insurance. So it's, it's very limited. VA has aid and attendance. If you have a long-term care insurance policy, private pay, of course. And then, if you have the coverage for personal injury as a result of a car accident, your auto insurance can pay for that. In every state, there's different rules, different policies, and different things. That's why I won't discuss Medicaid, because that's a state by state determination. But I just like helping. Before we started the podcast, I was going all over Michigan, literally with our team and myself. We were doing caregiver support groups, dementia educational seminars, you name it. We were trying to get resources and things out to these families so that they weren't in a position that I was in all those years earlier, not knowing that, oh my gosh, there's home care out there. And if we can afford that, that would be great. If nothing else, to give us a little respite. So I just enjoy helping people. And, I was actually interviewed a month or two ago and never had been asked this. A gentleman said, so you must regret it. And I said, regret what? He says, not finishing that pursuit of medical school. And I said, oh, wow. I've never been asked that. I go, but truthfully, I've never even given it a thought. I said, if I had regretted it in some way, or I felt like it was unfinished business I needed to take care of, I said, there was nothing stopping me from going back and continuing that pursuit. I said, but for me, I found I can help people, even I feel like on a grander scale, through our home care company and subsequently through, media channels.
And I think that what you just talked about there is something I talk about fairly often. Proverbs 69, right? It says that we can determine our course, but ultimately the Lord will determine our steps. So you and me both, we've kind of been down that road where this is what I think is best, but the road and the steps have changed, and we go with where we're led, and that's ultimately not necessarily where we planned. I mean, I think I've told you before, like, I never wanted to be in health. I worked oil and gas engineering, radically different, right? I never wanted to be here, but it's the circumstances we're given and the way we're led is in this way to support others. To
Absolutely.
other
For I know the plans I have for you, right? We may not know them, but he knows them.
Absolutely. How, over the time of doing your home care company, and even I guess in your time dealing with your grandmother, how have you seen dementia care evolve or change?
Well, I think not as much as at least I would like to hope. I think at least, if nothing else, with social media, with the work you're doing, the work I'm doing, and, countless others, I think there's a lot more attention being focused and turned to it, where in the past, even going back to the passage here in the States of the Medicare Act, people were considered senile, right? It was senility. It wasn't even really a medical diagnosis. It was more like a social, psychological diagnosis. So healthcare didn't really want to get involved with that too much. And I feel like that's part of, and I know, our good friend and Pete Hill at the D Word, and I think that's such a great name for his show, because it's very true in my opinion. Back then, they didn't want to say the C word of cancer because, there were so few options and treatments available, and prognoses were so grim. Doctors are here to heal and to treat and to make things better. And when they can't, that's a sign of their own, failings, they feel like, right? And so now it's the D word. How many times I've talked to families, or maybe yourself included, where a family has to go 3, 4, 5, even more to get an actual diagnosis of dementia, because, and I don't want to speak for doctors, obviously, but I've heard it enough where it feels like they're afraid to give that diagnosis because they know what that diagnosis will mean. So it's almost like if we don't diagnose this, maybe it's not real kind of thing. So I feel like the change though is I think society, a little more than healthcare, has really, sounded the alarm on trying to raise that awareness. I mean, you have, the great work you're doing and all these other great, creators, inventors, and companies where families are having to get the resources and information from everywhere, but where I feel like they should be getting it from, and that's from their physician and their healthcare team.
If we had to look at an American lens, what supports exist for all Americans if they come or if they have a dementia diagnosis?
Support in the terms from a healthcare standpoint or society?
From a healthcare standpoint. So in Canada, you get a certain amount of hours of support from a home care company, whether it's a government funded one or whether it's a private one. The company will go back and back charge the government. So there is those kind of supports at a certain level. Obviously, it can't cover 24/7 support and stuff, but those exist. And then there's support programs through, let's say, Alzheimer's Society that can come alongside and kind of fill in the gap, or you have companies like mine that come alongside and support the caregiver. So I'm curious what it looks like in the American lens.
So if you have a loved one and they need to go into memory care because it's not financially viable to keep them in the home for the care, or it's not practical for any reason, you put them in the memory care. Memory care is going to be paid for out of pocket. You really, you can go into a nursing home, but then you have to be in the hospital for 3 days for Medicare to cover it. But that's only going to cover it for a certain amount of time. Then they're going to come to you and talk about enrolling you into Medicaid. Medicaid, again, I won't get into much because it is a state by state, basis. I can just speak for Michigan. So there's really, you have a wonderful thing. I have some Canadian friends and, they talk about how you guys do get that quote unquote free home care. Obviously not the 24/7 like you mentioned, but that's still something rather than nothing. Now there are waivers, at your area agency on aging that if you qualify, you might get, a couple of hours of some respite, but again, that's also limited. And, there's a lot of roadblocks and obstacles to that kind of resource. Alzheimer's Association, 24-hour tip helpline where you can call and speak to somebody. There are caregiver support groups, virtual or in person. But as far as real tangible help, it's just not there, and there's options somewhat for your loved one. But like I said, some of those are going to be just, still cash out of pocket. Like we had a family who we were helping for many years and they put their loved one in assisted living and, against our better judgment and, recommendations, they got a good sales pitch. And so they thought it was going to be great. It lasted for about 30 days. And then that probationary or observation period was over by the facility. And they said, yeah, we don't think your mother's going to be a good fit for assisted living, but we can put her in the next level, which is memory care. And that's going to be an additional, $2,500 a month. So he moved her out of there, put her back in her little condo, and then months go by, he's found another place and he tried it again. He went through 3 different moves with his mother into these places, thinking it was going to be the answer and the secret, recipe to fix her. And each time they were saying, we need to put her in memory care. And at least for me, in my professional opinion, the longer you can keep your loved one in their familiar environment, which is typically their home, the better they're going to thrive. Not that it's going to cure anything, or maybe they can remember everybody's name in the family. It might not do that, but they're going to be able to function at a higher level because, as you know, with dementia, it's your short-term memory that is affected. Your long-term memory, hasn't been touched yet, and it doesn't get touched till really the very end. So they can still remember, okay, this is my bathroom, this is my bedroom, and it's that muscle memory of going through those actions that allow them to continue functioning at a higher level. But when you put them in a new environment, they never have sometimes the capability to get that from the short-term memory. All right, this is my new house, this is my new room, this is a friendly face, whatever. into getting into their long-term memory. So they're never able to thrive because they're not capable of thriving. Is that the case for every single person with dementia? Absolutely not. But it's more likely than not the case for most families with a loved one with dementia.
Yeah, keeping them, even if it's not necessarily in their home, but in a familiar enough location with familiar enough people, the loved
Absolutely.
ones. I mean, I've heard, I'm sure you have too, the horror stories of individuals being put in a facility, and then the facility employees themselves are overworked and
Yeah.
oftentimes underpaid, and they can't pay the attention that this person needs. And who is negatively impacted is the person living with dementia. And they're ultimately the person who we're put in this place to protect them and keep them safe and look after them and care for them. And then it doesn't always happen that way, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Absolutely.
What are some of the early misconceptions or mistakes that you see care providers make?
When you say care providers, just to clarify, are you saying like home care companies making, or
Yeah,
like the
anyone,
family?
any hired professional medical care, whether it could be even physicians, it could be nurses, could be
Okay.
healthcare aides, the people that we hire to support.
Sure.
And obviously I can't go and say, you're doing this technique wrong, because I'm
Yeah.
not aware of those things.
Sure. Yeah. So for me, well, my first frontline thing is always in value is, be honest. And what I mean by that is, here in Michigan, unfortunately, we're considered a non-licensed state for home care. You have to hire a plumber that's licensed to come fix your leaky faucet, but you can hire anybody that has a home care company to come in and take care of your loved one. You don't know if they're insured, bonded, workman's comp, all of that stuff that comes with protecting you as a consumer. So I always say, be honest with people. And that really also applies to your staff if you're a home care company. Andrew, we have a nice roster of employees, and our average retention of an employee is 6+ years. And we have some that are on the higher side, 11, 12 years. And it's because we're honest with them and we treat them with respect. We don't tell them things that aren't true. We walk the walk that we're talking, right? And they come to find that really quickly. And unfortunately, that's not always the case with people when they're coming into our doors. Most likely often have been at other companies who just take advantage of them. They're a body. And that kind of ties into my, being honest. When you're reaching out to a home care provider, or, and we'll get to like more mainstream healthcare staff in a minute, but a lot of times people that have home care companies, the operators, the managers, the directors, for them, it's a bottom line game, right? They're there to make money. I'm not motivated by financial gain. We have to have financial gain to function, survive, and, pay bills. But mine is just being able to help. And like, it's just who I am. It's my nature. And often, families, when they come to us, they've had an experience with another company, and the company will say, oh yeah, no matter what it is, yeah, we can take care of that. We're great at that. We can do this. We can do that. And then all they're doing is just sending, a carousel of different staff to your home. With us, we tell the families, you're going to have the same employee every day, every week. We don't do a revolving schedule, because it's not only to your benefit as the family, and they're going to get to understand your loved one as best they can, but it's also to the benefit of our staff too, because if we're sending them to a new home every week, how are they ever going to have any continuity of care? How are they ever going to have an appreciation and an understanding of the care that's needed and the best way to provide that care? So I tell people, just be honest. If you can't do it, don't do it, right? Because then it also paints a broad stroke over this industry where, if somebody had a bad experience with one home care company, they can assume easily that it must all be like this. Maybe we need to just put our loved one in a facility. So then it's also consequently to the detriment of your loved one, because you had that bad experience with somebody that maybe had not been honest and upfront with you. And, I think that's so crucial. And that can be applied across all aspects of providing care with doctors. I don't want to speak too much on what they're doing right or wrong as far as that goes, but I feel like often, families feel like the doctors aren't really listening to them because they can't. They have such a finite window of time to be able to sit there, talk about how things are going, but that's kind of where it stops. I'm a big proponent of when a doctor is seeing a patient, they're really seeing two patients. They're seeing the medical patient, but then they're seeing the family patient, the ones that are there day to day. Gain insight from them. It's hard to take a history or to get feedback from a loved one who has dementia. They may get facts wrong. They may get specifics messed up. They might not be taking their medication as directed or at all. Talk with that family and say, are there other things that we could be doing to help better support you? So consequently, your loved one will be getting better care and have a better outcome and be able to thrive on a higher level. I think it really comes down to talking to people and just being honest.
It's definitely moving that you have the average tenure of 6 years and folks that are at 11 years. In Canada, what I've seen all too often, unfortunately, is a revolving door of staff. The folks, in order to be working as a healthcare aide or a licensed practical nurse or a registered nurse, they have to meet these specific provincial regulatory requirements. But it's almost a bidding process. I will go wherever the highest person will pay me in it. And I've seen it firsthand, and I've heard about it firsthand from folks that are kind of stuck in the middle. Like, I had this great relationship with this person, and now I can't use them anymore because they went to this other company, which is tough. And the other thing I think, Lance, we see here is faceless home care companies, where this home care company, because we have a lot of home care companies here, and they say, we're blah 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 home care company. This is what we do. This is how we support. And like you said, there's nothing different that differentiates them. But then you say, okay, who actually is behind this? Who is the leader? Who is this, or what's the background of the person that created this? I want to understand, looking for my loved one, who's behind it? What is their background? What do they believe? How do they approach these care? What is their experience? Those things I would care about. But a lot of times it's like, I'm going to create a home care company and I'm just going to get people in, and I'll say I'll pay them so much money, and then we'll apply them and we'll make a bunch of money and we'll move along. And I see this often, and it's sad and it's scary, because the other side, then you have these companies that are doing amazing work, and they're having to compete against these companies that are faceless.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think too, Andrew, to me, at least here in the States, it's starting to resemble the nursing home, kind of model where, nursing homes are severely understaffed, and oftentimes, and I'm not taking, COVID and all of that into consideration. I'm just saying in general, because it was like that before COVID. And it's because it's investors, it's lawyers, businessmen, doctors. They get together and it's an investment, and the less staff you have, the higher your profit levels will be. It's not about the higher level of care. It's about the higher level of profit. A good friend of mine, Susie Singer Carter and Don Priest, and Rick Montcastle, they just had a tremendous film come out called No Country for Old People. And it really talks about the neglect and abuse in the nursing home industry. And it's because it's just become, like you're saying with these faceless home care companies, it's become an investment rather than, a healthcare model. And that's unfortunate, and I'm a big proponent in our team here and our company of all states being licensed and regulated. I hope to see that day at some point, because again, you people that, and this is the thing, like you and I, we have an understanding and, an awareness of the ins and the outs of healthcare and home care and et cetera. But the average person, the lady, 55-year-old school teacher who gets a phone call, mom needs to come live with you for a while. She had a fall. She had this, she had that. She goes to the grocery store a week or two later, and she's, obviously tired and stressed and everything else, but she, loves her mom. So she's trying to do the best by her mom, and she sees in the grocery store on one of the walls, need help with your loved one, tear this little tag off and call, and we'll provide the best care possible. And they have a company name on there, but in reality, it's not a company. It's just a lady and a couple of her friends who are looking to, make some money, and I tell families it might be $1 or $2 less an hour. And yeah, that might add up over a year's time, depending also on how much care you need. But it could also cost you a lot more too, because if one of those people hurt themselves taking care of your mom, who do you think they're going to come after? They're going to come after you and your mom. and now you got a big problem on your hands. Or heaven forbid, they steal, your mother's wedding jewelry and you can never recover it. Or you're getting ready to go on, vacation with your husband and kids for spring break or winter break, and that quote unquote company calls you the night before and says, yeah, I'm sick, I'm not going to be able to be there, sorry. Now, how are you going to still take your vacation? There's a lot of pitfalls to that little bit less, hourly rate by going with somebody that says they're a company, but they're in reality not, than just doing it the right way. I don't cut corners when I'm getting my vehicle taken care of because it's my vehicle. There's things you can cut corners on in life, and there's some things that you shouldn't cut corners on. And taking care of someone who's so special and dear to you should not be one of the situations you want to cut a corner on.
Looking at it from the other side of the coin, what are some of the mistakes or maybe misconceptions that you see families are making? Obviously, families are trying their best, but they're not necessarily clinical professionals. So what mistakes do you think that you often see?
Yeah, well, one of them would be, hiring somebody privately rather than an actual, brick and mortar company is a good idea. And I just explained the reasons why I think that is not a good idea. One of the other ones is, families not accepting reality, maybe, of, what their loved one is actually going through and who their loved one is present day. Meaning, we talk with countless families, and, it's usually the one who's the boots on the ground, day-to-day person taking care of mom. And then you'll have a sibling or two or three who say, well, I called mom and she's just fine, and them being able to actually be, understanding and accepting of what their parent or their loved one is dealing with. I think families need to just, instead of trying to ignore it and pretend like it doesn't exist, try to get a good understanding of what it is, and then trying to co-care together. Well, a son's not going to want to bathe his mom. I understand that. He's not going to want to help with toileting needs for his mom or her personal hygiene. But a son could say, you know what? I'm not local, so I can't be there every day or even hardly at all. But what I could do is I can coordinate all of her doctor's appointments. I can call in and make sure all of her pills are, refilled. I can send out progress notes from her doctor's visits. There's ways that you can still contribute and help support your loved one without actually having to be hands-on for your loved one, which, subsequently will help your sister, brother, whoever the sibling is that is boots on the ground. Because it shouldn't be one person does it all, because if something happens to that one person, then your loved one's going to be left with nobody there to support them. Then you're really going to have a problem. So I think a lot of it is just, trying to educate yourself as much as possible and take away a little bit of the defensiveness or the, deniability of nothing's really wrong, because oftentimes it's a lot more serious than what you're probably anticipating or even expecting. It's better to just deal with it up front than just to keep kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. So given that you've many employees and you've cared for many families, what does burnout look like in your experience? And how can caregivers recognize that they're, experiencing it before it becomes overwhelming?
Yeah. Well, are you talking about for professional staff caregivers or for family caregivers? Both. Okay. So for family caregivers, when you think you need help, you probably have needed it for a while. It just has taken a little while for you to accept that, because again, some people, they're very big on pride, and it's hard to ask for help and to accept help and think nobody can do it as good as you. And I will be the first to admit, professional help is not going to do it as good as you will as the family, because it's family. We try to match that and do the best we can. But at the end of the day, you have many years, if not since birth, relationship with your loved one, if it's a parent. And, that's a bond that, nobody can supersede or match, and nor should they be expected to. But if you're needing help, you need to also get it not only for you, but for your loved one. And what I mean by that is, if you're getting short, if you're getting cross, if you're having trouble sleeping, or you're, having trouble even functioning day to day, and instead of making a nice nutritious meal, you're like, let's just go through the drive-through and get you a burger and fries, and just let's sit you in front of the TV, and that will be your caregiver for the next few hours while I go nap. It's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to accept it also. If somebody asks you for help, I always recommend to families, when you get a minute, just go and jot down the top 10 things that could be helpful to you. It might be something as simple as your car needs an oil change. And if somebody offers to help, it doesn't have to necessarily be for your loved one. It could be help for you personally. And that just takes one thing off of your to-do list and off of your mind that you got to worry about. For our professional staff, we're very cognizant on making sure that they're not overworked. And so if let's, for instance, some of our staff do 412s a week, they like to have that extra 8 hours of overtime and then they got 3 days off, right? If you just worked 4 12-hour shifts in the same week, and it doesn't even have to be back to back, we're not calling you to pick up a shift. Now, you can volunteer and we will consider it, but we don't want to overwork our staff. We don't want them to feel like all they do is work. They got to have a life and they have to have time to enjoy things. And if they have children, go to school functions or holidays. We have people that wanted to take Halloween off and because they're a nursing student and they don't have children. And we had another person, and this would be in the same house because it's 24-hour care. One of the ladies in the house had asked for it off also. She has small children. So, respectfully, we met with the nursing student and we said, look, you've already, she requested Christmas off. And we said, we will try to get Halloween off for you. But, so-and-so has already asked for it off. And as you know, you're both in the same house and she wants to be able to take her kids trick-or-treating. The nursing student wanted to, go to a Halloween party, not that that's any less important per se, but she, and she was great about it. She says, no, I totally get that. She says, I'd rather have her just give it to her because I don't have kids and let her spend it with her children. So we try to do things as fair and balanced as possible. We're very generous on time off requests and granting them when it's at all possible. But at the same time, and that goes into the burnout, but when they're working so much, because we have some people that all they'd like to do is work, and we're kind of saying, well, you need to take a break, because you need to go take that day for yourself, whether it's, just going out with your friends or, just relaxing or, going to the beach or, whatever it is. I think everybody needs that component in order to be the best caregiver, whether professionally or personally as possible.
We had Dr. Sharon Anderson on a little while ago, and she was talking about this idea of the double duty caregiver. So the caregivers that would be working, say, for someone like yourself, but then they're also going home and then doing the care at home.
Right.
And she was saying that is a significant problem, at least here in Alberta, considering the amount of care professionals we have, that it's a significant problem here. What does that look like in Michigan?
Yeah, well, I can speak for us. I don't know of anybody presently that is doing double duty, personally and professionally. Not to say that hasn't happened in the past. I can think of an example in the past where that was happening. And, we would kind of scale back that person's responsibilities with us after, having a conversation because they didn't want to ask. And we're very, very open door here. We're accessible 24/7 for our employees and for our families. In fact, we don't even use call centers. We use, we have several office cell phones. And people after hours that work in the office that know our staff and know our families will take those, on our after hours for our calls. But yeah, I mean, that example from the past, we just sat down and talked with her because she had a very, very significant issue personally. And we wanted to make sure we were supporting her as much as possible instead of looking at, again, the bottom line saying, well, we don't want her to miss shifts because we'll miss, revenue. We set it up where we had one of our other employees who had the availability to shadow her for a couple of weeks. And then at the end of that couple of weeks, she scaled back her, responsibility with us. And we had it solved as well. So, we're not leaving that family that we're responsible to in the lurch. We're making sure that they're covered, but also at the same time trying to, protect our employee because of the situation she was going through. But other than that, I don't know of any others off the top of my head.
It sounds like, or I guess it's a breath of fresh air, let's say that, with how you're approaching it. Because that definitely seems proactive, frankly right. So
Yeah.
I appreciate how you're going through these things and how you have thought about these things in the past, because it's important.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, and and Andrew, like I said earlier, with having been a family caregiver for my grandmother and my father, and growing up just having nothing but reverence for the healthcare industry, I also want to treat them, in golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated, right? And I think that without sounding like I'm bragging about it, but I think that also says why we have such great retention, because we tell our staff, I'll just give you an example. We interviewed a lady, now it's probably a few months ago, and on paper looked amazing, an all-star caregiver applicant. And before they ever come in, up front, they will, pull down resumes and applicants, and they will do a pre-screen over the phone to make sure they're going to meet the qualifications that we have, because we function and we're established as a licensed company. We have all of the protections. I mean, there's certain things we can't do because the state is not a licensed regulated state, but everything else we can do on our own, and we choose to voluntarily because we're trying to be as reputable as possible, and et cetera. So when she came in for her interview, I actually sat in on this interview, and, we were going to schedule a second interview with her. And we always ask the applicants, no matter who they are, do you have any questions of us? We've just asked you quite a few questions. Is there anything we can answer for you? And, she said, well, everything you said, I just got to say, sounds great. She says, but the only problem is that's what the last company told me too. And I said, I can appreciate that. I said, but let me say this. I said everything, and I was kind of joking. So she knew it wasn't said in a negative tone or malicious way. I was saying, but let me tell you this. I said, the last applicant that came in here said the same things you said to us. How do we know? I said, and we had a lady, she didn't make it through orientation, and she sounded great and said the same things you said. And when she was ready to come off of orientation, she quit. I go, I'm not holding what those people did against you, because that was them. But I would just ask for the same consideration, that what other companies have said or done to you, you don't hold that against us, because we're us. And using that analogy of other staff or employees or applicants, I think really resonated with her, where she's like, okay, that's fair. I get that. And she's been an outstanding employee ever since. And, we just tell her, give us the opportunity to prove what we're saying is true, and when they shadow our current staff, people that have been here for years, they're not just hearing it from us. They're hearing it from the people that actually are a part of the company and that have worked with us for so long. And, but I tell people, if we don't follow through on what we're saying, or we, mislead you in any way, I go, you might as well quit now, because we'll never regain that trust from you. So, that's why I started early on in this conversation. Just be honest. That's the best answer I can give anybody for being successful, is just be honest, because as long as you're honest, they can never accuse you of not following through or giving them the wrong information or breaking a promise. If sometimes the honesty is not what they want to hear, and sometimes it is, but as long as you just stay with that, qualification of always being honest, I think your staff will respect you.
So shifting a little bit, what led you to create the podcast? It's won awards, talked to amazing people, all home care matters. What led to the inception of that?
Yeah. So, 2019, the world is hearing about this coronavirus and COVID-19 and this, horrible, thing going around, this pandemic. And, having a company, we get information that isn't necessarily given to the public at the same time. So we're getting things a little bit earlier, because our company continued to function and operate all throughout COVID. And it started becoming very obvious. And if you recall early on in our conversation, I'd mentioned how, we would have multiple support groups going around the state, all in different areas. We'd have dementia seminars. We would have, fun events like lunch with Elvis, and have an Elvis impersonator come in and sing while they're eating, and, just a lot of fun. And that, I had so much joy doing that in our team. It's just, out there mingling and talking with people. And we made the decision prior to our governor and said, you know what, we're going to have to cancel and stop all of these events until this thing gets cleared up. And it was just days later, our governor, ordered the 2-week lockdown. And then we realized, okay, the 2-week lockdown is going to probably extend to a 4-week, then a 6-week. And so I actually was out at the track one night and I was listening to a podcast. And at the time I had no idea what a podcast even was. And I'm embarrassed to say that. I thought they were basically all of your, TV outlets and different things, and they would just take the audio format and then you can digest it that way rather than watching it on television. I quickly realized that podcasts are pretty much something anybody can have at any time. And so I actually went home. I told my wife, I have an idea, kind of like the idea to start our home care company. And I did some research and discovered, there's a lot of space out there. There's room for another podcast to do what we wanted to do. I took some lessons in training with a Hall of Fame broadcaster because I never had any interest whatsoever to have my face on the internet at all. It just kind of comes with the territory, right? And so we launched the show. And as we're getting ready to launch, I said, well, if we're going to do the audio, I said, why don't we also do the video? Because you're getting the same work twice. So now we can reach people on YouTube and, Instagram with the videos, and then subsequently it goes out to all the audio platforms. And so we launched it, and we thought at the time, it's probably just going to be a few months. And as we all know, it ended up being almost 3 years. So I had 3 years of just really trying to fine tune the show and come up with different ways of reaching people. And so here we are now, 5.5 years later.
And almost 400 episodes later, which is amazing. When you look back, Lance, what has that process taught you that you can actually apply to your home care company?
I think I don't know that I could put my finger on a single thing it's taught me, but I think what it's done is reconfirmed and installed in me that families need help, and that they're not getting the help and the information where I personally feel like they should be getting it firsthand. And that's, with their healthcare providers and their healthcare team. So that's why we keep doing it. I think it's also why, like your show and our show and the other shows out there are doing such great work and getting the numbers and people following and listening and downloading and engaging is because they're still not getting the information where they need to get it from. So they're turning to the internet, they're turning to social media, which can also be dangerous. We've turned down quite a few people who wanted to pay us a lot of money to put their product on our show. And it was like the cure to Alzheimer's. And we just politely say, sorry, we cannot do that. So, it's a good thing and a bad thing, but I think the good far outweighs the bad, because I think the bad kind of take care of themselves, right? They don't last. So I think as long as you're doing good work and good information, hopefully one day, shows like ours and yours and others won't even be needed, because people will be getting that information and support where they should be getting it at.
100%. Is there one guest or story that's really stuck with you and kind of been that little voice in the back of your head that says, I need to consider this as I make choices or decisions?
Yeah, and it's not going to be one that anybody knows. I don't even think she's on social media anymore. It's more of a little voice that says, keep doing what you're doing rather than anything else. And it was fairly early on. It was a mother in Australia, and we got an email. And she had sent just a beautiful email. We get emails all the time. Some you just read quickly, some, catch your eye in different ways and different times. And she just said, I really have been listening and following you for a long time. And this was like 3 years ago. So, the show was only about 2 years old. It was fairly known, but I don't think anywhere near what it is now. And she said, I just feel a comfort watching and listening to you, which to me was like major imposter syndrome, because like I said, I literally never had wanted Facebook or any social media whatsoever. And she said, I wanted to see if you would consider me as a guest. And I go on to read her story, Andrew, and she shares how her son, who was, I think at the time, 18, 19 years old, roughly, and I could be wrong on the years, but I know he was of adult age. She said, I've never shared this story anywhere at any time. My son was born with Williams syndrome, and I chose when he was born not to share that with anybody, and especially not with him. I did share it with him once he became an adult, and I just really want to share this. And So we set up a meeting with her, and I already knew we were going to do it, but I still wanted to just, talk with her and to learn more because I was fascinated because obviously you and I are both sons of parents and you and I are both parents of children, right? So we can see this from both sides. And, even before meeting her, I'm thinking to myself, I go, man, would I do that if it was one of my kids? Would I want to tell them? But wait, what if it was me? Would I want my parents to tell me? To me, I've still never really had an answer I could, stick a flagpole in and say, this is where I'm standing as far as my opinion on it. And, met with her, had a beautiful conversation. And she said how she didn't want her child, her son, to ever grow up feeling or be treated differently just because he was born with Williams syndrome. And she said, so I made the decision to never tell a single person. Now you could look at him and yes, you could tell there was something different, but because he wasn't labeled and because he didn't know, he never had an excuse to not succeed. He never had an excuse to fall back on and use as, oh, I can't do it because of this. And he graduated college. In fact, the day her and I talked, he was actually flying from, I think, Canada, actually, to Australia by himself. And it's just a remarkable story, but not only just the dilemma or whatever you want to call it, the question I had about it, would I want to know or would I not want to know? Would I tell my kids or would I not tell my kids? But it was the fact that here's somebody in Australia. I don't know her from anyone. She doesn't know me from anyone. Didn't even know she was listening, following, or subscribing to the show. And she chose us after all these years to share this story that she'd kept to herself for, 18, 19 plus years. To me, that was the greatest compliment I think anybody could give me. And we've interviewed United States senators and governors and everything else, but that one will always, I think, stand above the rest because of the trust and confidence she placed in us to tell her story.
Yeah, it gave me goosebumps when you mentioned that because, the fact that she believed in you and the platform to tell that story and be vulnerable. I mean, especially if she doesn't have social media and then she's obviously a step back from wanting to really talk about things, but she trusted your approach to navigate that discussion. So that's remarkable.
Yeah, it really means a lot. Yeah.
Are there any themes that resonate across the nearly 400 episodes, themes, thoughts, topics that kind of keep coming up?
Well, one is supporting, family caregivers. I think if I had to put a theme on it, I would say 85, 90+% is that families don't know what they don't know and they still don't know it this day. And what I mean by that is something we've discussed. They're turning to the internet, YouTube, podcasts, social media, what have you, to try to understand what they're facing and what they're going through and what their loved ones going through. And the other part is that the, almost 400 episodes, all these people that we've talked with over the years, they're all trying to help these people, that there's great people, there's great companies, there's great organizations trying to do really good work to support these 64 plus million unpaid family caregivers in the United States.
Yeah, it's difficult. And I think it's complicated because I hear often that families are on the search for something. They're in the search for information. And where do I find it? How do I do it? And all too often I find that, especially with dementia being a kind of umbrella term, the lot of the resources are for Alzheimer's versus other forms of dementia. So I've heard firsthand of families that are searching for resources and they get Alzheimer's specific resources and it ends up resulting in poor outcomes,
Absolutely.
poor supports. They may be great in a specific use case, but not their use case, which is hard, right? The families have to try and discern that when they don't necessarily have the clinical wherewithal to make those decisions.
Right. And even after they get a diagnosis, Andrew, a lot of them will say, well, my dad doesn't have dementia, he has Alzheimer's. And then, we'll kindly explain, well, you can't have Alzheimer's and not have dementia, but you can have dementia and not have Alzheimer's. It's just, it goes back to they're not getting that, resource and support that they need and education. Once they get that diagnosis, a good friend of ours, and I don't know if I've said this to you before, but I love using it, but I don't take credit for the term. He says it's diagnose and adios. Once you get that diagnosis, it's adios. they're not getting that support after they get that diagnosis.
I never thought about that. Wow. I know there's a guy, and he lives in the West Coast here. His name is Jim Mann, and he is considered the Canadian, the most influential voice in Canada for
Wow.
people living with Alzheimer's. He got diagnosed 18 years ago with Alzheimer's. He still takes the bus by himself. He goes, gets his groceries. He's written 86 academic papers in the last 18 years, which is remarkable for someone with Alzheimer's. But he even says, like, just because I have this thing, it doesn't define me. I am going to define it, and I'm going to see how long I can keep pushing to grow and to keep doing things that matter. And I'm like, yes, Jim, that's perfect.
That's the attitude to have. Absolutely.
So from all your years in the field, whether we talk about the podcast, whether we talk about the home care company, whether we talk about caring for your grandmother, what are some of the small practical things that you think caregivers can do day to day to make a difference? And let's talk about family caregivers at this point.
Yeah. I think one of them is, asking and accepting help. I think practical, when you're asked for help on the spot, you don't know when it's going to happen. You're on the spot. So, you might not be able to quickly come up with something that's going to meaningfully help you. So that's why I always tell people, when you have the time, just sit down, jot down on a piece of paper the things that you could accept or really benefit from having help with, so that when you do get asked, it's going to actually have a positive impact in helping you, and you'll know what you need. The other is, take time for yourself. It's horrible to say that a lot of times to caregivers because, it's kind of like, well, if I had the time, don't you think I'd be using it? But try to be intentional about setting apart the time. If your loved one gets up late, maybe you get up a little bit earlier just so you can sit there and kind of, breathe for a little while before the day begins. And, try to seek out other support. And what I mean by that is, maybe you can't physically go to an in-person support group, but maybe you could find one online. At least just go in and, check it out, see if it's going to be a good fit for you, because oftentimes, family caregivers, like I said earlier, the siblings aren't always harmonious in their understanding and agreement on what's going on with mom or dad. But people in a support group, they're going to have that in common with you. As far as they're also caring for a loved one, it may not be the same situation, the same dynamics, but what is the same is you're both a caregiver for a loved one. And, the support group's there to help you outside of the support group. So, you make some acquaintances, you connect with one or two or more people in that group. Then on those rough days or those tough days, pick up the phone and just talk with them. If nothing else, you can just vent, and they're going to understand and appreciate it better than most.
If you could speak to a caregiver listening right now, someone that's exhausted, unseen, if you had one sentence to help them, what would that sentence be?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
I'll give you two sentences, Lance.
Okay.
If it helps.
Well, I think first and foremost, letting them know that they're not alone. You're not alone. There's millions of other caregivers out there. That's why I always recommend a virtual or an in-person support group. But the other part of it is to, remember why you're doing this. And that's easy to say, hard to do. Your loved one, they were hopefully there for you when you were younger. You're now there for them. And they're not going to be here forever. So make those memories and be proud of what you're doing, because at the end of the day, nobody can ever take that away from you.
When you look forward into the future of dementia care and the role of family caregivers specifically, what gives you hope?
That more people are aware of the realities of being a family caregiver and what family caregivers go through, and that everyone is united in trying to raise the awareness about this horrific disease. But I also want to add a caveat to that, and you mentioned it about Mr. Mann. People with dementia are still people, and they're still very capable of contributing and having a purpose. And helping your loved one find a purpose will also help you too.
100%. I mean, for me, this company was created for my grandmother. I didn't even create any of our deliverables as a way to let's monetize this or commercialize it. It was I want to look after my grandmother and find a way to make sure people care for my grandmother. And the entire time was about let's look after my grandma and make sure my grandmother's taken care of. And I think I didn't see her as a person living with dementia. I saw her as my grandmother. It was just a little more complicated now than it was when I was 10. But she's still the same person that I would call almost every day after I went home from school to work, helped me with my language arts homework and vocabulary because it was a train wreck. But she was still that person. So the person we'd play Scrabble with, and I would cheat every single time we'd play. But like that was who she was, and that was our relationship. And I'm glad that I didn't define her as this person with this thing and define her as that thing. Instead, it's just this my grandmother, right? And I think the family misses that.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
sometimes.
Yeah, 100%.
If you had to give one last advice, word of wisdom, one last note, whatever that is, to the audience, what would you say?
It's going to be a note 1 and note 2. I always like to remind people, and I mentioned it earlier, know that you're not alone. I think that's crucial because being a family caregiver can oftentimes feel and leave people feeling isolated and like they're the only person on earth, right? But the other part of that is, once you step into that role as a family caregiver, look for the help that's going to fit you the best. There's a lot of help out there. And I don't just mean, paid help, but I mean help for you, resources, information, these support groups where you can find peers and those that are going through it or have gone through it just to lean on because they're going to understand what you're going through. Before I had children, I would not be able to give parental advice to somebody, right? Before you're a caregiver, nobody's really looking to give you advice, and you can't really give advice until it's a role that really supersedes everything else you've ever done in your life. Having that extra help and even some hope will help you on those days when it's more difficult than not. And there's going to be bad days. Likewise, there's also going to be some really rewarding days. I know many people who have taken their family caregiving journey and have turned it into such tremendous advocacy work to help other family caregivers. And so, just know you're not alone and that there's a lot of help out there.
I agree with you so much. And I think that the caregivers listening will as well. Well, thank you, Lance, for joining us. Your stories, perspectives, experiences have been such a breath of fresh air. Well,
my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you for, likewise, keep doing all the great work you're doing.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for being here. If today's conversation resonated with you, follow the Dementia Collective wherever you get your podcasts and share this episode with someone who you think might benefit. And if you'd like to grow this movement, please consider becoming a member of the Village on Patreon. Among other benefits, you'll get early access to every episode, plus the satisfaction of helping powerful voices like Lance's reach more caregivers around the world. And finally, if you're on your own caregiving journey, remember, like Lance mentioned today, you're not alone. At BlueBell here, we exist to help and connect you with the supports and resources that truly fit your family needs. Until next time, you are strong, you are not alone, and you're doing something that matters more than you know. Till next time.